Okay.
Here.
Rebecca J.
Here.
Tori Middlestat.
Here.
Alex Paraskavis.
Here.
Kate Schwarzler.
Here.
And Natasha Cronin has been asked to be excused.
Okay, has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from the September 14th, 2020 meeting?
Yes.
Any corrections or changes need to be made? If none need to be made, I'll accept the motion for approval of the minutes.
So
So
moved.
moved. Oh, yeah.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are approved. Okay, I think we can move right along here. Obviously, we don't have any visitors out in the office or in the waiting room. Don't have any unfinished business, so let's just move along to new business. And Fred, can we have the staff report on the potential revisions to the Independence Development Code for the industrial standards?
Right. Yeah. So, we've been doing this for the residential standards. We've also done this for the commercial standards. And so sort of continuing along, especially since there's kind of a lull in what you folks are doing right now, made sense to us to do the industrial standards next. And so you will see it's same basic format. It's got allowed uses in subchapter 37 is what we're proposing. Basically, I mean, it's funny because all of these different code sections have pretty much the exact same list of uses. And so it made sense to us to take those and to put them in subchapter 37 and just simplify stuff to help us see what's actually allowed in the industrial zones. You'll see that subchapter 38, similar to the residential and the commercial zones, would include sort of the density and dimension standards for the zones. Oh, I should sort of back up, and it would have been smart of me to get out a zoning map so we actually know where we're talking about. So let's take a little detour. Let me try and share this screen here real quick. Just got a couple of things to do before I can share my screen. Okay, let's just say, and then hopefully I can find wherever I put my zoning map. Oh dear, where'd I put my zoning map? That's not it. Come on, zoning map. All right, zoning map. So, can you guys see that? Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Zoning map. Hey, look at that. You can see here, this is the zoning map of the city of Independence. So it's always good to take a look at this every now and again to know what is allowed where. So you can see primarily our industrial areas are up in the north part of town. The IH is the heavy industrial area. The lighter gray, which is the IL, is our light industrial area. Right here, this is the airport right here, just to orient yourselves. This is Polk, this is Hoffman. Right here is Stryker Road. And here, whoops, excuse me. Right here is Main Street or Highway 51. So that sort of orients you. You can see right here, this is our third industrial zone, which is called Industrial Park. And it just applies to this parcel right in this area. There are just a couple of odd sort of locations for heavy industrial. This is that spot where the rail tracks sort of come through here, and there's sort of a warehouse with a train sitting in front. They sort of refurbish trains, is my understanding, on this site. And then scrolling down further, oh, come on, Pooter. You'll see right here, This is also a heavy industrial spot right here. And that's where it's sort of at the end of 10th. It's where the old mill used to be. And again, I think that they do something with train axles or something out there as well. Shoot, what is going on with my scrolling up and down? All right, and I'll just call out this too. These are a couple of light industrial spots off of G Street. This is where well, no, that's, this is where the Simplot building and whatnot is. So are there any questions about where the various zones are? I'll also just point this out. Check out this little anomaly. This is City Hall, right? And right next to City Hall, this is zoned heavy industrial, which doesn't quite seem like it should be, but according to the zoning, it is. I think that where that zoned heavy industrial, that's a pretty small little spot. It'd be hard to put an industrial use onto it. But I mean, it's just one of the oddities of the zoning in the city. So, so that's sort of what we're talking about as we're looking at these zones. Just wanted to give you a sense of where these things are. So when you see IL, that corresponds to the light industrial area right there, just south of the airport primarily, and along Main Street. The IH is between Stryker Road and really the rail line, but there's some over on Main Street as well. And then the IP is that lot right next to the airport.
Fred?
So, yeah.
Fred, this is Sally. I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about the industrial park and how that's different? I don't quite understand how that's different from the light or the heavy industrial.
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things that is probably so similar that it probably didn't warrant actually having a separate zone. There are just little things about, let me just, there's different dimension requirements. One of the things is just sort of setting it back from the street a little more than is required in other zones. But yeah, that's really, I think that's basically it. The light industrial zone and the heavy industrial zone are very, very similar. Or no, excuse me, the light industrial zone and the industrial park zone are very, very, very similar. It's really, let me just double check here. It's really those yard requirements that I think are slightly different. And I think that part of what, I mean, honestly, what I think the intention of the industrial park zone was to get some sort of planned concept on that piece where somebody was considering the whole site together and using some sort of integrated plan.
Okay,
I just don't,
that makes
I don't,
Isn't the lot size different in the industrial park? It's like they have larger lots that are the minimum. So it'd be,
oh yeah, that is another one too. So you'll see the minimum lot area in subchapter 38, there's a larger minimum lot area as well. So yeah, good point. But yeah, it's those are basically the two things that are different about that spot. Whether
Thank
that
you.
warranted creating a whole nother zone is questionable, but that's sort of how it got done.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, you can sort of see how that sort of works. Basically, it just reduces the amount of pages in each of these things and hopefully enables us to see better and clearer what is allowed in one zone versus another, right? And hopefully just see these things in a much clearer way. Also, it just eliminates redundancy. You can see that the standards for marijuana facilities that I put in subchapter 45, they're in all of the zones right now. Every single one of these zones has exactly the same language. And that's something that just drives me nuts because I I honestly don't like redundancy. Part of the reason I don't like redundancy is because in 15 years or whatever, when somebody's going to change this code and they've got some sort of issue in, say, the heavy industrial zone, they'll change it in the heavy industrial zone. They'll change the language in the heavy industrial zone, and they won't make similar changes in the industrial park and the light industrial zone. And when that happens, invariably what will happen is in 20 years, when some planner picks it up, they're going to think that all of the standards are exactly the same when in fact they're different. And so where possible, I am a firm believer in pulling out standards that can stand alone and then referring to those standards. So when there is an issue, you don't have to change it in 3 places. You change it in 1 place, and you can make that happen. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does to me.
Yep.
So basically, that's what these standards are. I honestly don't think that there's any substantive changes in this. Basically, what I did was just pulled out the use tables from the zone, or I pulled out the use list because it's just in a list right now. I pulled out that use list and put it in a matrix form. I pulled out the lot sizes and put that in a matrix form, and that's really what the intent of this is. So are there any questions about it or any thoughts that you folks would like to talk about?
I always appreciate when things get simpler and easier to understand for both people working for the city and anybody who's trying to work in with the city, whether it's a developer or neighborhood or whatever. So I appreciate that you're trying to consolidate it.
That's exactly it. You know, it's easier for me, which I like, but it's also easier for everybody. If it's easier for me, then it's easier for everybody to understand. Yeah.
Fred, I just have a quick question. So looking at the allowed uses, it's fairly standard for manufacturing and, associated or things relative to that scale. And I noticed that the only retail use in there was for a recreational marijuana retailer.
Yeah.
So is that, it seems like it's odd to mix one retail use in with industrial type area.
Yeah, it's a good point. When you look at the standards in subchapter 45, what it talks about is you can have a retailer so long as it's no more than 10,000 square feet, and it has to be on the same lot as a producer or a processor. So the whole idea, and you see it at something like 905 North Main, that's a retail use, the Mary Jane's, marijuana out front, and then in the back there's production. And so the only reason that the retail was allowed out front was the production was allowed in the back. Now, does that then make sense to apply a similar concept to other uses? I think absolutely. Would it make sense, for example, to allow the production of wine and then a wine tasting room? Absolutely, that makes tons of sense. The idea is that it's incidental to the industrial use. And I think that's how we've sort of applied it in the past too, is that uses like that can be incidental to the industrial use in the zone.
Okay. And I would think that most retailers aren't going to locate out there unless it was, so for example, Marquis Spa could put in, say, a showroom or something like that. And if they decided they wanted to sell retail, they could.
Right.
But I would imagine most people wouldn't choose to go that route necessarily.
Right. That's exactly it. For some reason, I was just seeing if I could find it, but But no, I think that's how we've typically, we've viewed activities like that as sort of incidental to the primary industrial use, you know?
In Washington, in one of the little cities just east of Yakima, they have an industrial sort of site, but it's wineries who have their production there, but then they all have tasting rooms and you can just walk around. And it's rather a nice idea. I don't know if that's what somebody was thinking about with your industrial park, but that's something that could go there, I would think.
Yeah, that's, what city is that? Is that Prosser?
Yes. Yeah. You know it.
I know it. I actually was, I had a faculty at Eastern Washington University who was doing some work with Prosser about wine and industry and Prosser. So I know at least a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Carlton has a space like that.
Cool.
Well, thank
Cool.
you, Fred. That simplified another section. That's a lot of hard
Yeah.
work. So from this process on, we don't need a vote or anything. You just can implement this on your end.
No, so if you guys are fine with it, then what we'll do is we'll go through the whole public hearing process. It requires a public hearing and whatnot. But because there are no changes to the substance of the code, it doesn't need to go through any sort of notice or anything. But if we ever do want to change some sort of substance in the section, it's going to be a whole lot easier for us to do that in the future. I think it's going to be easier for us to change.
Yeah, I'm all for it, Fred. Thanks for your work.
Yeah, no problem.
Any other comments or questions for Fred? All right, well then we'll move along to the floodplain standards. Can we do the staff report on that, Fred?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know. Floodplain standards, I mean, you sort of got to deal with floodplain standards, right? It's just sort of what you got to do. Like we get floodplain regulations from the federal government, and what happens is essentially if you're not doing it, then the feds, through often an intermediary like the state, come in and they say, hey, if you don't update these things to meet our standards, we're going to cut your flood insurance. And so it's always like one of those things where it's like, some of it just, but it happens every now and again. And so anyways, basically everything that we do with floods is basically mandated by the federal government. They give us flood plains that we're supposed to regulate. They give us flood standards that we're supposed to apply, and all this sort of stuff. And every now and again, the state comes in and they look at everything, they see how we're doing. It's called a floodplain audit. And they'll say, oh, well, you're doing pretty good, but you need to update your standards to reflect our standards. And you can tell that the city did it in the past because you can tell that they just straight adopted state model language, because I'm looking at this language side by side. It's very similar, but they definitely added some stuff. And so basically the city went through the last version of their floodplain audit, and they came back and they said, you need to reflect all these changes in our model code. Ultimately, the substance of those changes is not all that great. I've sort of lined them out for you so you can compare one code to the other. Now, our recommendation is that we just adopt the new state model code, because it's not really going to change the substance of what we're doing. It does add some procedural stuff to make it clear that if we change our boundaries, we let FEMA know. That's something that's not in there. there's various things like you need a letter of map revision if you change a water course, right? Stuff like that. And so we went through this and we said, you know what, it's just going to be easier to just straight adopt this model code. And so that's really what we're recommending now. Again, since we're talking about this, let me try and share my screen. Oh dear. And see if we can share screen, my entire screen. All right, so basically, boy, floodplain regulations. Here is our floodplain in the city, and you can really see it. FEMA has gone out. They'll tell us things like the flood elevation at various points. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but you can see this is from Polk County's website. They just mapped FEMA's map, right? And so it says, this says 165 right there. That's the flood elevation at that point. This is the South Fork Ash Creek. You can see this is an older version of it, and I'm gonna show you two maps here in just a second that have revised this. So this is the Willamette River right here. This is Ash Creek, and this is the South Fork Ash Creek. And again, here is that industrial site right there. And so you'll see that this is really, these colors represent the mapped floodplain where a flood elevation has been established, 162 in this case, 162, 163, 164, and so on. And then this represents something where the floodplain elevation has not been established. This is what they call, I think it's called the unmapped AO zone, or it might be an unmapped A zone. I can't remember. I want to say AO. And so anyways, you can see the South Fork Ash Creek at this point, when it was originally done, didn't have flood elevations really set for it. Now, based on this, what cities or even property owners can do is they can come into these places and they can submit something called a letter of map revision, or a LOMAR, is what you'll hear said a lot. So this is a letter of map revision, and I just downloaded this from FEMA. This shows a change that was made. Let's just see which one this is. This one is for the downtown area. And you can see that here's Monmouth, there's Maine. This is the letter of map revision that got completed for prior to the Independence landing project. So you can sort of see how those flood elevations got revised, right? Does that make sense? There's also another one sort of near, let me see. There's another one that was done near Inspiration Garden. So this is G Street, this is F, this is 7th right here. And this shows how flood elevations were done further to the south. Now, further south of that, it says it's a A zone, unmapped A zone. So it's mapped, but there's no flood elevations established for it. So anyways, this was another LOMAR that got done by the city for the South Fork Ash Creek. Now, essentially, we take these maps and various standards apply in various places, and you can see it real good on this map. The hatched area is what's called a floodway. In floodways, you really can't do much in floodways. That's where water is moving, right? That's where water moves. It's the most hazardous spot of a stream. So you don't want to be putting buildings and whatnot in where water is flowing, right? This zone right here, where a flood elevation was established, this is the 100-year floodplain, or they'll just call it a flood, the floodplain. You can build in this, but it needs to be built a foot over whatever flood elevation gets established. So on this one, you can see in this area right here, this is 169 right there. Or I'll show you right here. Well, it's easiest to see it down here. So 169 right here. So if somebody is trying to develop in this area right here, you anticipate this is going to be like 168.7 or something like that. They have to develop their houses to have their finished floor at least a foot over that flood area. So that's how that whole thing works. And that's how our current code works right now. And that's how the future code would continue to work. Any house that goes in, you would have to have that finished floor a foot over that floodplain. Any sort of mechanical equipment also needs to be over that floodplain, a foot over that floodplain.
Fred,
Yeah,
has it been mapped south of there where all the building is going to be going?
you can see that I'll show you this. When we look at this one, we can see where so this is Brandy Meadows 1 right here, and I can zoom in on that. So this is where Brandy Meadows 1 is right here. You can see this is there's no floodplain established for it, but you can see where the flood plain, or there's no flood elevations established for it, but you can see where the floodplain has been drawn. And so, so everything right now, so we know where the floodplain is, and everything is outside of this drawn floodplain right now, if that makes sense.
So there's no elevations, but they use that old map for their construction.
Right. That for Brandy Meadows 2, they have contoured where the stream is, and they have a sense of where the flood elevation is, and they're well above that foot.
But there's a lot of space south of that and westward where the creek is that hasn't yet been
Right.
really.
Right. That's exactly right. So, and part of the reason why they didn't map it was because at the time that this originally was done, a lot of this way was farmland. And so at a certain point, and I think that FEMA will probably come in and do a map at a certain point again. But I don't know, I haven't heard any rumblings about it. FEMA's always sort of revising their maps, or always going through some sort of process. So because this is looking more and more going to be more and more urbanized, it really makes some sense to have flood elevations established.
Right. That was my question, because it's going to be built. So it seems like we ought to have that information if you're going to approve building and development there.
All right. Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so yeah, that's sort of how this whole flood plain system works. So in reality, what's getting changed here is just not a whole lot of things. I'll stop sharing this screen, and I'll just sort of flip through this. Seems let me just see. I mean, you can see my comments in the little attached document. It notes where, hey, this section's longer, like the duties of the floodplain administrator, that's a longer section. It felt to me like a lot of this was longer in terms of administration. So I was trying to make it clear what we do when, and who we're supposed to contact. You know, the community, if we annex property, we're supposed to let FEMA know. If it gives us revised descriptions of how we're supposed to do a variance, all that sort of stuff. There's also stricter standards for when variances can be applied. They say under this, if you've got a larger lot, the burden of proof is harder to achieve because you should be able to get your building in a good spot on a lot if it's a big lot. Oh yeah, one thing that it does do is it sort of calls out garages, which our current code doesn't do. It also calls out appurtenant structures or accessory structures, and you can see that we're recommending adding language regarding fences, just because we have fences in the floodplain and we don't, it's always one of those things where it's like, how do we treat this thing? Oh yeah, and shoot. One thing that we're proposing doing as part of this too is we're proposing limiting the notice requirement, because it really is one of those strange things to notice. Basically, if you achieve the flood standards, we think you're probably good to go. If people comment on a proposal and they're achieving the flood standards, we're going to essentially take that comment and then approve it anyways, right? If that makes sense. So it's kind of one of those things that's like a frustrating comment to do.
I had
really
a question about that though, Fred, because
Yeah.
if it's a flood area, very little changes to drainage systems can change the water flow into the neighbor's area and flood them. It doesn't
Right.
take much digging to disrupt how water's flowing just below the surface. So if I had land, I would want to know if somebody next to me was going to be excavating and changing how the water goes. I've seen that a little bit of change makes a big difference on the property next to it. And so I had a question about why you wouldn't let people know.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely could. I mean, the thing is, it's one of those things where if a person then turns around and says, I don't want them digging, it's going to flood my property. Basically, if they're meeting the flood standards, we can't then say no. I mean,
But
it's one of
that's-
those, it's
yeah,
one of
but-
those things where we have like set criteria. If they meet the criteria, they're good to go. And I mean, the criteria really are they raising their house above the floodplain? Are they raising their mechanical equipment?
But your criteria doesn't say anything about changing drainage patterns. And I just wonder if someone does get flooded, if their field gets too wet for their whatever to be there, or whatever happens, or they get some erosion because the water's draining differently, do they have any recourse for the changes that were made that affected their land?
Well,
Right.
aren't we kind of talking about two different scales? I mean, on the one level, we have FEMA, who's regulating it, say from like a state level, and then there's local stormwater, right? So if I go out in my backyard and I start digging around and it impacts my neighbor, that's not a FEMA issue. In my mind, that's a local public works probably issue.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and we deal with that all the time, where we deal with that all the time, but it's like some of the, I mean, I guess I'm more than happy to keep the notice requirement in there. I'm just kind of one of these folks where if I reach out to somebody to ask them to comment on something and they comment, I would like to be able to reflect their comment in some meaningful way. And ultimately in this, like, I don't believe under this code that I actually have the authority to say anything in regards to flooding. Like, I can't take this and then say, oh, your neighbor said that you're gonna flood their house. You need to do a hydrogeological assessment to prove that you're not gonna flood the house. The code doesn't give me that authority, right? It just doesn't. And if we are going to go to that level of authority, I mean, that's way beyond what FEMA wants us to do. And so I guess my question really becomes, how then does notice work? Because I mean, that's what every notice is. I mean, if we get a comment, it's going to be something like that, like they're going to flood my house. And
Yeah,
What-
what you're saying is there's no provisions in the code. Somebody can comment and be upset, and that's fine. Our job is to assess every project relative to what the code says, and it's an up or down vote, not whether we agree or disagree, but it's what does the code say? Does this proposed project meet the code? And there's not a mechanism for you to require a study, do whatever else. So making a public comment is sort of just, it's sort of inviting maybe some, I don't know, unhappy thoughts basically on the back end, because you can comment all you want, but as long as it meets the letter of the law, it doesn't really, our hands are tied too, you know, as a commission. Like, we don't get to decide what we want.
right.
I get what you're saying.
That's exactly it. I mean, that's fundamentally like the, I mean, really in this, is so prescriptive. This is what you are supposed to do, you know, raise it up, whatever. And so based on that, I guess my question is, what value then is the comments? Now, I like comments. I just don't see how they sort of work in this situation.
Because there's not much outcome. There's not much that can change the outcome for something like this, comment or not.
Right. That's what I think. And, you know, even at my last job, and I honestly think it was probably my last two jobs. Neither of those places had a public comment associated with a floodplain permit. Now, if we do want to keep the comment period, I do think that if we do want to do that, let's make a provision to ensure that some of these things, like fences, don't get caught up in having to be providing notice for a fence, let's say, right? Because that, or an appurtenant structure, like essentially a small shed, I question the value of a comment period for something like that. So I guess that's another option. So we could either keep the comment period, remove the comment period, or tweak the comment period so it only applies to certain things. And really, I mean, I'm fine with any one of those options. I guess my sort of thing and my proposal is, what does a comment period actually achieve? You know,
I'm just concerned about somebody having recourse if they have damage. So if it doesn't come here, where does it go?
right. Well, I mean, so, but again, this is gonna be before a land use is ever built. So if they say that place is gonna flood my property, if they build that house, it's gonna flood my property, what am I supposed to do then?
I don't
mean-
know. That's my question, is not just you, but also the person who's going to be flooded. Do they have any recourse?
Right.
Or if they suffer damage, is the city then liable for that?
Well, no, I mean, that's one thing right there is, that's in the model code is, hey, this, and it's in our current code right now, is that the city is not held liable for this. And you can see that, let me, where is that at? It's somewhere in that model code.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's on page 53 of your packet. Oh wait. Oh yeah, it's page 54, page 53 and 54 in your packet. So you can see the little warning. The degree of flood
Disclaimer.
protection required by this ordinance is considered reasonable for regulatory purposes and is based on scientific and engineering considerations. Larger floods can and will occur on rare occasions. Flood heights may be increased by man-made or natural causes. This ordinance does not imply that land outside the areas of special flood hazards or uses permitted within such areas will be free from flooding or flood damages. And then the disclaimer of liability, this ordinance shall not create liability on the part of the city of Independence and the officer or employee thereof, or the federal insurance administrator for any flood damages that result from reliance on this ordinance or any administrative decision lawfully made hereafter. So there is that, and I mean, that's just straight out of, I mean, that's straight from FEMA.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I had a question on page 48. It talks about preventing or regulating construction of flood barriers. I just wondered who checks that, because like train trestles and old bridge abutments and stuff can trap trees, branches, brush, and they can hold water back and then flood an area that wasn't anticipated. Who does that kind of checking to make sure that that stuff is cleared up?
Right. Well, so practically at the city level, it's nobody at our level. But you know what? If we see a whole bunch of fill going in, like along the South Fork of Ash Creek or whatever like that, if we see something like a levee that's going up, that's going to push flood water someplace else, we'll go out there and we'll talk to people about that. So
I'm more concerned about stuff that comes down the creek and gets jammed up. That's really not anybody's particular, nobody was doing it on purpose. It's just what the water moved down. And in the next flood or two floods later, it can hold back the water and then break, and you have a much bigger problem than you would have had. I just wonder if there's anybody that checks along those drainages to see if there's material backing up.
that's a good question. You know, I don't go out there and I don't look at creeks, partially because you know waters are not my jurisdiction. You know, that's where you start getting into the State Department of State Lands and people like the Army Corps of Engineers. So I haven't done that, and I actually don't know a whole lot about waters in Oregon. I definitely knew a whole lot more when I was up in Lewis County in Washington, because there's rivers all over that county. So yeah, but yeah, I honestly don't know. That's a good question.
I know Fort Collins, Colorado had a bad flood a few years ago, and people lost their lives because stuff had built up behind an old railroad trestle, and then it flooded an area and several people lost their lives.
Yeah, you know, like, I mean, the flood I mean, I know exactly what you mean. Like the flood in 2007 in Lewis County, it dropped a whole bunch of trees down a hill. And basically what happened for every one of it would hit a bridge, all these massive trees, and then the whole river would back up. And then there'd be so much pressure behind the trees that it'd wash out the bridge, and it would go down to the next bridge. It would do exactly the same thing, take out that bridge and then go on. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's crazy. The one thing that, I mean, we don't have a whole bunch of riparian vegetation that's gonna be like falling into the stream and damming stuff up, just at least like the South Fork of Ash Creek or Ash Creek. I mean, it's what happened in Lewis County was like a whole hill lost its trees. There was like a landslide that dropped the trees into the creek or something.
And that's not something you can change at that point. I'm just concerned about buildup over years, and just wondered if anybody was tasked with checking those kinds of structures for those kinds of debris dams?
I don't think, I mean, definitely people go out and inspect bridges and whatnot, so they look at stuff like that, but in terms of like doing a whole creek assessment, to my knowledge, nobody's doing that, so.
Okay, thank
I
you.
would think the state would check the bridge over South Fork Ash Creek on Monmouth Avenue, and then where Ash Creek goes under 51 before it hits the Willamette. And then
Yeah.
I would imagine if there's issues like down past my house here where South Fork is, would the City of Independence, like Public Works, be monitoring a big rain event possibly?
You know, I don't know how that works. So,
Or if it would be just up to the public, if we're out and about, we could report it in, I suppose.
yeah, I mean, if you folks see stuff, yeah, let
I
us
know
know.
ODOT does periodic bridge inspections, so I think it depends on the jurisdiction of who the bridge is under. So I think the railroads have to do the same thing if it's an ODOT bridge, if it's a Polk County bridge. So then that probably would just leave the question of local. I know a lot of the engineering companies, are on contract or go through periodic contracts of going through counties and doing inspections on bridges and stuff. So I would imagine it falls into that.
Yeah, there's all sorts of bridge inspection documents out there, so.
Thank you. Just wondering.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Okay, any other questions of Fred on the floodplain information?
Fred, I assume you have to notice this. as
Yeah,
well.
we're gonna have to notice this one, and this might be one of those ones where we do have to send out notice, and so what I'm gonna likely have to do is send it to every floodplain owner in the city. So what, and the reason that we got to notice this is, I mean, I think anybody could probably make the argument that they're getting more restrictive standards now, be it, just even slight changes to how a garage works or whatever. So based on that, we're going to send out this notice. How notice works is if you make something more restrictive, you're supposed to notice it. And because this could probably easily be argued to make things be more restrictive, we'll probably notice it. So this will come back before you at a public hearing. It probably won't be for a couple of months. But yeah, that's probably what we'll do.
Okay. All right. Any other discussion or information items we need to address tonight?
Did we resolve how we want to handle the comment situation? Like, Fred, do you feel like you have enough information to go with what you need?
I think it's a great question. I mean, how would you folks want to resolve that comment situation?
I think I'm fine with following what you had proposed, just because I think if lacking a mechanism sort of to do anything else, it just seems like you're inviting a lot of, you could be inviting just sort of a lot of like discontent with no real, and there's no real lever to pull. There's no real mechanism to solve that. And so it just seems not quite worth it. So I'd follow your recommendation.
I agree.
I agree with Alex too.
Becky?
If there's no mechanism, I guess there's not much difference.
I guess I say that just because I feel like for a lot of folks, there's like the planning commission is not a political body, and so you come to comment at the planning commission, and the planning commission is just, like I said, is just up or down votes on what's the code say. Does the proposal meet meet the letter of the code. And like, that's what and obviously we change codes and we can make decisions to change the codes and whatnot. And that's when comment is of course useful and invited. But for specific projects, it doesn't seem sort of worth the consternation. That's my feeling.
How about you, Sally?
Yeah, I agree with Alex's comments there. It doesn't seem like it's worth it, really.
Well,
It
we'll leave
just
up
is-
to- oh, go ahead, Becky.
It's interesting that the hydrology is not really addressed at all in these FEMA standards.
Well, hydrology is, but for floodways. And
Yeah.
so, and for when you have a floodway, and again, you remember the floodway is where there's velocity, right?
Right.
Where it's the most dangerous part of the stream. When you're in a floodway and you're increasing flood height, you have to do a hydrological study. And you have to show that there's a no rise. It's called the no rise analysis. And that has to show that you're not impacting other people. But again, that standard's in there, right? If we get the analysis that says they're not gonna cause a rise, that's an analysis they're meeting that standard at that point. If that makes sense. So there is one hydrological, there is hydrological assessment at the time of when it's in a floodway, but when it's in a floodplain, it does not consider hydrological assessment at all.
I imagine there's probably more problems with sort of runoff on sort of over the historically for like stormwater management and like changing something and then having the rain collects here, not sort of separate from floodway and from like sort of these FEMA floodplain definitions.
Yeah, I would say so. It's interesting. It's stormwater is such a we keep on running up against it as a city. You look at some of the new houses going in. What happens is they'll sort of core out the street, they'll put some of the dirt on the lots, and then inadvertently they'll like mess up how the drainage is working on the neighboring lots, right? By how they've done the digging out the foundation and whatnot. And so that is, we've struggled with that. We feel like we talk to builders about it all the time, and still we're dealing with that pretty regularly. So, we're well aware of the issue. We're trying to, like a good example, well, I won't give examples, but we deal with that all the time, where we're trying to solve stormwater runoff. And a lot of times it's between residential lot,
Right.
in the middle of, yeah.
I guess that's why I'm okay with kind of the comment, because that has nothing to do with floodplains, right? That's a stormwater piece, and that's outside of that, and so this is very kind of distinct and specific.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and really, there's just there's some floodplains and Independence. But ultimately, there's not a whole ton in the grand scheme of things. I'll show you sort of where the big one is. Let me share my screen one more time. Share my entire screen. Yes, come on, let me share. All right, this guy right here. So you've got the high school right here. You can see this is a big floodplain right here. And in my time being here, I've seen 3 floodplain permits come through, and 2 of them have been in this area right here. Now these these lots are not, we're not gonna see a whole bunch more development in here. So I mean, this is like ultimately the biggest floodplain. You can see it really gets a lot narrower as it's coming through a lot of the rest of the community. And even sort of in this part of Brandy Meadows, where Brandy Meadows is down here, that's a fairly defined creek right now. So whereas there's like a little drainage that comes up here, and apparently this little drainage floods quite a bit. So anyways, you know, in the grand scheme of things, I mean, this floodplain right here, even through here, is fairly defined. So we just don't have a whole ton of floodplain in comparison to a whole lot of cities. Like, I mean, Lewis County, where I was at, a lot of Lewis County is floodplain, right? I mean, all of Centralia and Chehalis is just about floodplain. So yeah.
Thanks, Fred.
Yep.
Okay, then we're settled on the matter of the comments then. Okay. Any other discussion or informational items we need to share tonight? None? We're all good? Everybody's good? Then we could, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
I so move.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Opposed?
Hi.
Opposed? Okay, we are adjourned. Okay, see you next
Thank
month.
you.
Thank you.
Cool.
Bye.
Awesome.
Thanks, Fred.
Take care, guys.